On May 29, 1913, a ballet premiere in Paris ended with fistfights in the audience, screaming so loud the dancers couldn't hear the orchestra and the police being called. And the piece that caused all of that, it's now considered one of the most influential musical works of the 20th century. Today, we're breaking down Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, specifically what made it so musically radical, why audiences literally rioted, and how its fingerprints are all over the music we listen to right now. By the end of this episode, you'll understand the specific techniques Stravinsky used to blow up the rules of classical music and why a 1913 ballet still sounds startlingly modern today. What on earth was happening in that theatre in 1913?
So picture this. It's a brand new, very chic venue, the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in Paris. The audience is dressed up, they're expecting a ballet. And what they get is something that sounds like nothing they've ever heard before. Stravinsky's score is brutal, dissonant, rhythmically chaotic. Nijinsky's choreography is deliberately earthbound, no graceful leaps, no satin point shoes. And the crowd just loses it.
Like, actually loses it? Not just polite booing?
Physical fights broke out. According to the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, the arguments were so high decibel that the dancers literally could not take their cues from the orchestra. The police had to be called. This was not a polite disagreement. This was a full-on uproar.
And Stravinsky at this point, was he already a big name? Like, did people know who he was?
That's the wild part. According to Lumen Learning's Music 101, Stravinsky was a young, virtually unknown composer when the impresario Sergei Diaghilev recruited him to create works for the Ballets Russes. The Rite of Spring was only his third project for the company. He'd done The Firebird in 1910 and Petrushka in 1911, which were successful, but this was a completely different level of ambition.
So he wasn't some established legend trying to shake things up. He was basically a newcomer swinging for the fences.
Exactly. And the piece itself, the concept was developed with an artist and mystic named Nicholas Roerich, whose name actually appears alongside Stravinsky's on the title page of the earliest publications of the score. The full title is Pictures from Pagan Russia in Two Parts. The story follows ancient rituals celebrating the arrival of spring, and it ends with a young girl being chosen as a sacrificial victim who dances herself to death.
Okay, so it's not exactly Swan Lake?
Not even close. And that contrast is really important context. According to the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, by the early 1900s, Russian ballet had lost a lot of its creative energy. The most prestigious theaters like the Mariinsky and the Bolshoi were heavily dependent on story ballets and what the CSO describes as uninspired music. So there was this hunger among young Russian artists, composers, choreographers to break away and try something genuinely new.
So the riot wasn't just about one weird ballet, it was kind of the explosion of a pressure that had been building.
That's a really good way to put it. The CSO actually draws a direct parallel between the artistic revolution Stravinsky was part of and the political revolution happening in Russia at the same time. The Tsarist regime was seriously threatened in 1905 and eventually toppled in 1917. And like Russia's political rebels, many young artists longed to break away and try something new. Stravinsky was very much part of that wave.
That's a fascinating parallel I hadn't thought about. Art and politics moving in the same direction at the same moment.
And it's worth noting, the piece was originally going to be called The Great Sacrifice, which honestly tells you everything about the mood Stravinsky was going for.
Okay, so let's get into the actual music, because I think that's where things get really interesting. What was Stravinsky doing that was so different? Like, what specifically made this sound so alien to that 1913 audience?
There are a few things happening at once, and they all compound each other. The first is rhythm. Stravinsky completely broke away from traditional metrical patterns. According to classicalcomposer.org, in the celebrated Dance of the Adolescents, he employs constantly changing meters. The pattern alternates between 2, 4, 3, 4, and even 5/8 time. That makes it almost impossible for listeners to settle into a regular beat.
So you can't tap your foot to it. You can't find the groove.
Right, and that's deeply disorienting for an audience that's used to the predictable rhythmic flow of 19th century classical music. And on top of that, he's using polyrhythms, multiple contrasting rhythms happening simultaneously. According to classicalcomposer.org, this mirrors the chaotic and primal themes of the music itself. The rhythm isn't just a vehicle for the story, it is the story.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. the structure of the music is doing the emotional work.
Exactly. And then there's the harmony, or the deliberate lack of conventional harmony. Stravinsky uses what's called polytonality, where two or more keys are played simultaneously. The most famous example is the chord that opens the Augurs of Spring. According to classicalcomposer.org, it's a dissonant combination of E-flat and F-flat major triads played together, just slammed on top of each other.
Wait, so it's not just one key that sounds a little off, it's literally two different keys at the same time?
Two different keys simultaneously, creating this wall of tension and energy. And that was deeply unconventional at the time. Traditional tonal harmony is built around the idea of a home key. You leave it, you create tension, you return to it, you resolve. Stravinsky just refuses to resolve. He sits in the dissonance.
And I imagine that's incredibly uncomfortable if you've been trained to expect resolution.
Profoundly uncomfortable. And then there's the orchestration on top of all of this. According to SoundSci, Stravinsky used unconventional instrumental combinations and timbres to create what they describe as a raw, primal sound. One of the most striking examples is the opening, a solo bassoon playing in the very highest part of its register. CNN described that as absurd, and yet somehow it created a haunting and unforgettable sound.
A solo bassoon at the top of its range. That's not where you expect a bassoon to be.
It's almost painful to play. And that's kind of the point. Stravinsky was using traditional instruments in completely non-traditional ways. According to Lumen Learning, that use of traditional instruments in non-traditional ways is one of the key things that paved the way for the experiments of later composers.
So it's not that he invented new instruments, he just completely reimagined what the existing ones could do.
Exactly. And that's actually a more radical move in some ways, because it means the disruption is coming from inside the house. He's using the same orchestra everyone else is using and making it sound like something from another planet.
Okay, I want to push back a little here because I think there's a question worth asking. Was this intentional provocation? Like, did Stravinsky know he was going to cause a riot? Or was he genuinely just following his artistic instincts?
That's a great question. And honestly, the answer is probably both. The piece was commissioned by Diaghilev, who was very much in the business of shaking up the old musical order. The CSO describes him as a noted impresario who had a track record of pushing boundaries. But the specific musical choices Stravinsky made, the polytonality, the irregular meters, the dissonance, those weren't gimmicks. They were deeply intentional artistic decisions rooted in what he was trying to express about pagan Russia.
So the provocation was a byproduct of the vision, not the goal itself.
That's how I'd frame it. And what's remarkable is that even the people who hated it in 1913 came around pretty quickly. The Guardian noted that the immediate reaction was hostility, but within a year, its genius was acknowledged even by its detractors.
Within a year? That's a pretty fast turnaround from call the police to, okay, this is a masterpiece.
It really is. And Britannica notes that The Rite of Spring still strikes many contemporary listeners as a startlingly modern work. Over a century later, it doesn't sound dated. It sounds like it could have been written last decade.
That's the thing that gets me. Most music from 1913 sounds very much like 1913. This doesn't.
And that's the real measure of how far ahead of its time it was. According to a 2022 paper published in Art and Design Review by Junxiang Liu at the Queensland Conservatorium, The Rite of Spring has become a classic work in the history of music for its original composition, ingenious layout, and bold, innovative spirit. Liu describes it as an outstanding landmark work because of its uniqueness and exclusiveness.
And Liu's research specifically looks at its influence on 20th century Western music and contemporary world music. So what does that influence actually look like? Where do we see the Rite of Spring's DNA showing up?
So the most famous framing of this comes from the composer Pierre Boulez, who called The Rite of Spring the birth certificate of 20th century contemporary music. That's a huge claim. He's essentially saying that everything that came after in modern music traces its lineage back to this one piece.
The birth certificate. That's a striking image.
It really is. And when you look at what Stravinsky opened the door to, the use of dissonance, atonality, irregular rhythms, unconventional orchestration, you can trace those threads through basically all of 20th century classical music. The modernist composers who came after him were building on the permission he gave them to break the rules.
And it's not just classical music, right? I saw something in the research about connections to much more contemporary genres.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. According to research compiled on academia.edu, scholars have specifically examined how the Rite of Spring's primal rhythms, dissonance, and themes of ritual sacrifice resonate with and inform contemporary music genres, and they specifically call out heavy metal.
Wait, heavy metal?
Heavy metal. Think about it. The aggression, the dissonance, the rhythmic intensity, the themes of primal power. The Rite of Spring was doing all of that in 1913. The aesthetic vocabulary is different, but the underlying impulse to use music to access something raw and primal is the same.
So Stravinsky is like a great-great-grandfather of metal. That's not a sentence I expected to say today.
And it makes a weird kind of sense when you think about the premiere. The audience rioting, fights breaking out, the police showing up. That's basically the energy of a very intense concert. The Rite of Spring was the original mosh pit.
Okay, I love that framing. But let me ask you something. The piece was also, according to Lumen Learning, widely considered one of the most influential musical works of the 20th century. That's a massive claim. Do you think that's earned? Or is some of that reputation built on the mythology of the riot?
That's a fair challenge. And I think the honest answer is that the riot is part of the story, but it's not the whole story. The riot got people's attention, but the music kept it. The specific innovations, the polyrhythms, the polytonality, the orchestration, those are technically and aesthetically significant, independent of the drama of the premiere.
And the fact that it still sounds modern over a century later kind of proves that point.
Exactly. If it were just a scandal, it would have faded. Scandals fade. But the music didn't fade. It kept influencing composers, kept showing up in scholarship, kept being performed. According to Britannica, in the mid-20th century, Stravinsky actually revised the orchestration for concert performance, and that revised version is still the most commonly performed today.
So he kept working on it. It wasn't just a one-and-done provocation. He was genuinely invested in the piece as a living work.
Right. And it's worth noting that, according to Lumen Learning, although The Rite of Spring was designed as a work for the stage, the music achieved equal, if not greater, recognition as a concert piece. It outgrew the ballet. The music became its own thing.
That's actually kind of poetic. The thing that caused a riot in a theatre became something people sit quietly and listen to in concert halls.
And the ballet itself had a complicated afterlife. According to Lumen Learning, after a mixed critical reception for its original run and a short London tour, the ballet was not performed again until the 1920s, when a version choreographed by Leonid Massin replaced Nijinsky's original. So the choreography that caused the riot essentially disappeared for years.
The music survived, but the original choreography didn't. That's a strange kind of legacy.
It is, and it speaks to how the music was the truly revolutionary element. Nijinsky's choreography was shocking, but Stravinsky's score was the thing that permanently changed what music could be.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the 3 periods of Stravinsky's career. The Liu paper from Art and Design Review identifies the nationalist period, the neoclassical period, and the dodecaphony or 12-tone music period. The Rite of Spring comes from the nationalist period. Does that framing help us understand what he was going for?
It really does. The nationalist period is when Stravinsky was deeply engaged with Russian culture and folklore. The Firebird, Petrushka, the Rite of Spring, they're all drawing on that well. But the Rite of Spring goes further than the others. It's not just inspired by Russian culture, it's trying to access something pre-civilizational, pagan, ancient. That's why the dissonance and the rhythmic chaos feel so right for the material.
The music sounds like what the story is about. It's not just illustrating the ritual, it is the ritual.
That's a really precise way to put it. And according to SoundSci, Stravinsky's use of atonal melodies was a deliberate choice to evoke the primal and pagan themes of the ballet. By stepping outside of traditional tonal structures, he was able to create what they describe as a sense of timelessness and otherworldliness. The music doesn't sound like it belongs to any particular era, which is why it still sounds modern.
Timelessness through primalism. That's a paradox I hadn't considered before.
And it connects to the broader modernist movement of the early 20th century. SoundSci describes modernism in music as characterized by a desire to break away from the constraints of traditional forms and harmonies and to explore new ways of expressing emotion and ideas. The Rite of Spring embodied that spirit completely.
And Britannica calls it one of the first examples of modernism in music. So it's not just influential within modernism, it's foundational to it.
Foundational is exactly the right word. And that's what makes Boulez's birth certificate quote so apt. It's not just that the Rite of Spring influenced modernism, it's that it essentially announced modernism's arrival.
Okay, so here's a question I keep coming back to. If this piece was so ahead of its time, and if its influence is so vast, why don't more people outside of classical music circles actually know it? Like, it's not exactly a household name for most people in their 20s.
That's a really honest observation. And I think part of it is that the influence has been so thoroughly absorbed that people experience it without knowing the source. When you hear a film score that uses dissonance to create dread, or a piece of music that refuses to resolve into a comfortable key, that's Stravinsky's legacy, even if the composer has never heard of the Rite of Spring.
So it's like the influence became invisible because it became universal.
Exactly. The techniques that were shocking in 1913 are now just part of the toolkit. And that's actually the highest compliment you can pay to a revolutionary work. It changed things so completely that the change became the new normal.
And yet the piece itself still sounds radical. That's the thing that keeps striking me.
Because it's not just a collection of techniques, it's a complete artistic vision. The techniques serve the vision. And the vision, this idea of accessing something ancient and primal through music, that doesn't get old. It's not a trend. It's tapping into something fundamental about human experience.
And the research from Junxiang Liu at Goldsmiths, University of London, the 2023 chapter published in Research Aspects in Arts and Social Studies, specifically frames the Rite of Spring as having significant impacts on both 20th century Western music and contemporary world music. So it's not just a Western classical story.
Right, and that's an important point. The innovations Stravinsky introduced, particularly around rhythm and the use of non-Western sounding scales and modes, opened doors for composers working in traditions outside of the European classical canon. The piece's influence is genuinely global.
So when you step back from all of this, the riot, the music theory, the century of influence, what does it really come down to?
I think it comes down to this. Stravinsky looked at every rule that governed music in 1913, how rhythm should work, how harmony should resolve, how instruments should be used, what a ballet should sound like, and he didn't just break those rules. He replaced them with a completely different set of possibilities. And those possibilities are still being explored today.
And the fact that the audience rioted tells you something important. It wasn't just different, it was genuinely threatening to the existing order. People don't fight over things that don't matter.
That's a really sharp point. The intensity of the reaction is itself evidence of how radical the departure was. If it had just been a little unusual, people would have shrugged. The fact that it caused physical fights means it hit something deep.
And within a year, as The Guardian noted, even the detractors acknowledged its genius. That's a pretty remarkable arc.
It is. And it's a pattern we see again and again in the history of art. The things that provoke the strongest initial resistance are often the things that end up mattering most. The Rite of Spring is maybe the clearest example of that pattern in all of music history.
So here's what I want listeners to take away from this. The Rite of Spring isn't just a piece of classical music trivia. It's a case study in what happens when an artist refuses to work within the boundaries of what's acceptable, and what the long-term consequences of that refusal can be.
And the specific consequences here are enormous. The polyrhythms, the polytonality, the unconventional orchestration, those aren't just historical curiosities. They're the foundation of a huge amount of the music that came after. From 20th century classical composers all the way through to contemporary genres that seem completely unrelated to a 1913 ballet.
Including, apparently, heavy metal.
Including heavy metal, which honestly makes the riot make even more sense in retrospect.
Here's the thing that lingers for me after all of this. In 1913, the people in that theatre who were booing and fighting thought they were defending music. They thought Stravinsky was destroying something. And what he was actually doing was building something that would outlast everything they were trying to protect.
And that's the real provocation the Rite of Spring leaves us with. Because somewhere right now, there's a piece of music that people are dismissing, or finding uncomfortable, or actively resisting, and it might be the next birth certificate. The next thing that rewrites the rules so completely that within a generation, everyone takes it for granted.
What music are we fighting about right now that our kids are going to call foundational? That's the question the Rite of Spring keeps asking, over a century later. If a ballet can start a riot and end up changing all of music, maybe the thing that's making you uncomfortable right now deserves a second listen.
Hello everyone, if you're loving what you're hearing and want to lend a hand, you can drop us a little tip, just $1, $2 or $5 through our special PayPal QR code. It's really simple and your support means the world to us. Thanks a bunch for being such awesome listeners. Feel free to let me know if that's more to your liking.